Hi, this is Nate, and today we're going to be reading Chapter 60, The End of the Cold War. In 1989, the Soviet Union broke into pieces. Yes, the Soviet Union, the USSR, the land we called Russia, a nation composed of many states, fell apart. The Soviet Union's military power didn't collapse. Communism did. As a political system, communism had failed. It had begun with high hopes as a visionary experiment. The experiment hadn't worked. It had turned Russia into an unfree, tyrannical, clumsy nation. Karl Marx's economic ideas hadn't worked either. Government ownership of land and products didn't bring efficiency and productivity. Finally, the burden of ever-growing military needs helped wreck Russia's economy. Trying to keep up with the Reagan-era military might have helped do it. When the Russian people had had enough, they just threw communism out. It was stunning. It was peaceful. It meant that everything had changed in the world's politics. The Cold War was over. It was hard to believe. Now that Russia was a free nation, there was no giant to battle. At first, we didn't seem to know what to do. So down here we have a picture, and it says, in 1989, the Soviet Union fell apart, a momentous event symbolized by the removal of the statue of Vladimir Lenin, the founder of Russian communism. But it was becoming clear to most people that we are all passengers on the same global spaceship. The European nations had joined together to form a common market, called the European Union. They began acting economically as if they were one giant nation. Japan was a major economic power. Nations like South Korea, China, India, and Indonesia were making big moves in business. The world's economies were all becoming linked, as nations that had once been communist began to change to free market economies with little government control. People all over the world wanted freedom. When students in China rebelled against their corrupt government, they paraded around with the statue of the goddess of democracy, modeled after our Statue of Liberty. The Chinese government sent troops who opened fire on civilians in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Many students were killed. This picture over here goes with that. It says, when thousands of Chinese students demonstrated and raised a statue of the goddess of democracy in Tiananmen Square in the capital of China, the government broke up the demonstrations and killed many of the rebels. So, moving on. The fall of Russia communism was giving oppressed people everywhere an awareness of possibilities. It gave us a new appreciation of our freedom. Ronald Reagan championed those freedoms worldwide, but it was the 41st president, Republican George Bush, who was able to take us in a new direction. Bush was a practical fellow with a low-key manner and an ability to tackle details. The son of Connecticut Senator, Bush was the youngest pilot in the Navy during World War II, and a genuine war hero. After the war, he moved west to Texas and became an oilman. But it was government that fascinated him, and he served in a series of important jobs, right up to the vice presidency under Ronald Reagan. In 1988, he became president himself. He promised no new taxes, but all those years of war preparation had been hard on us as well as on Russia. Bush became president at a time when cities were in decay and schools were behind those of many other nations. Crime was epidemic, and the huge national debt was making many Americans fearful of the future. So President Bush worked out an agreement with Congress, which was controlled by a Democratic Party majority, to raise taxes. It may have helped restrain the debt and thus take a step toward prosperity that was coming. It didn't help George Bush with the American people, but his foreign policy did win approval. When Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq, sent troops into neighboring Kuwait and took over that nation, Bush led a forceful response. The United States, with the United Nations, stopped Hussein's aggression in the powerful, short Persian Gulf War. President Bush led a military response from August 1990 to February 1991 that would be known as the First Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm. Working with the United Nations, the president put together a coalition of nations that quickly drove Iraq out of Kuwait. Airstrikes on well-defined targets were coordinated with an effective ground force that raced through Kuwait and into southern Iraq. President Bush and his military advisors achieved their goal, an independent Kuwait. So before we move on to the next page, we have a picture here, and it says a U.S. F-117A, known as the Stealth Fighter. Then we have another picture down here. U.S. Marines advanced during the ground war in Operation Desert Storm. So moving on to the next page, they resisted pressure to capture Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein for 2 reasons. Iran, they thought, was an even more dangerous threat to Iraq, and a strong Iraq was necessary to contain Iran. The second reason for holding back, they understood the occupation of a defeated Iraq would be costly and dangerous. Some criticized President Bush for that decision, because it left Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq. The next time President Bush called out American forces, it was to help starving people in Somalia. That nation, which elbows out into the Indian Ocean from the east coast of Africa, was in a state of crisis. Crops failed. Armed thugs were terrorizing and killing. Armed thugs were terrorizing and killing. There was no effective government. Our Marines brought food and some help. We worked with the United Nations. Our aim was to make peacekeeping a whole world venture. But good intentions don't always matter. In the former Eastern European nation of Yugoslavia, which had been split into several different nations, some of them claiming the same land, Serbs and Croats and Muslims began killing each other, partly because their religions were different. The horrendous war, with ethnic cleansing, or mass killings, finally ended with an agreement negotiated in Dayton, Ohio, in 1995. In the face of such calamities, we started asking ourselves some hard questions. Does the United States have the responsibility to try to solve the problems of other nations? Is it done best with armies or with negotiators? Or should we concentrate on creating a just society at home and hope that the rest of the world will take notice? Up here we have a picture. It says, a Serbian woman grieves in a makeshift cemetery during the ethnic and religious civil war in the former Yugoslavia. Then we also have a caption over here. It says, there are some 1,290 different religions practiced in the United States. In this country, people of all faiths live together in relative harmony. We have never fought a war over religion. Most people agree that it is because of our First Amendment. It separates church and state, which means that our government keeps its hands off when it comes to religion. That isn't true in most other countries. At the beginning of the 1990s, more than 30 religious wars were being fought around the globe. Okay, so that was chapter 60. I hope you all have a great day.